Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, and I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud. And if your goal is to look back at something in the last week of Daf Yomi in just 30 minutes today, then you've come to the right place. For those who've joined us for a long time, you know that we have a rotating cast of wonderful teachers who lead these sessions. And so you will know already Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, who's going to steer us around this week in Bava Batra.
All right. Good morning, or insert the proper time based on your time zone. It's great to see everybody. Um, and we're gonna dig in. Today, I'm gonna share a Mishnah that we read towards the end of the week, which presents one of the rules about buying and selling a property. And then we're gonna look at a story that the Gemara presents related to the Mishnah and do some comparing and interpreting of what the Gemara does with the law that's in the Mishnah. And you'll see in a moment. Some of the chapter that we're studying deals with when two people enter into an agreement to transfer property, someone buys a piece of property from another. And in the days of the rabbis, they didn't have title offices like we have today, or such careful maps and surveys like we have today, or definitely not GPS like we have today. And the Mishnah has been dealing with times when people say, I'm selling you this property of this size, and they're estimating, and their estimate's a little off. Or I'm selling you, property with certain borders, and it turns out it doesn't turn, in actuality, after the sale goes through, the property doesn't turn out to be exactly as described by the seller in the sale, and there's a difference between that. If you've bought or sold a home, at least in the United States, that's the only place I've experienced doing so. There are many steps in the process beforehand to keep it from getting to the fact that after you acquire a piece of property, it turns out not to be what you thought it was. Although sometimes I know from personal experience, like, on the smaller end, sometimes not the land itself, but that happens where post-closing, a buyer discovers, hey, there's supposed to be a microwave in the kitchen and I can't find it. Something like that, and you have to correct for that. In some ways, that's what the Mishnayot of this chapter are looking at. What happens when the sale isn't really exactly what it was as advertised, and there would have been different permutations of that, and we're going to look at one in just a moment. So I am going to share my screen right now to bring up the text, and I'm going
Rabbi
to,
Goldberg, would you drop a link in the,
yes,
in the chat
I'm
as
doing
well,
that
please?
also.
For folks who want to open in a different window. Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Ooh, all right. Yes, I'm going to do that as well. Let me just grab the link. I thought it was on my clipboard, but it is not. Uh, Here we go. Copy link. And I am putting the link in the text, and the settings should be set that you can open it if you wish. There we go. Okay. So the text that we're going to study appear on Bava Batra 106 towards the end of this week, but you'll recognize themes from early in the week if you're reading the text yourself. And the Mishnah says the following here. So if one sells the field to another, telling him that he is selling him a field measuring a beit core, that's been the standard unit, the standard size field that we've used as a example in this chapter of the Mishnah. So one person sells a field to another and says to him, "I'm selling you a field that's a beit core."
I'm
And
sorry, Rabbi Goldberg. We still don't have the link
it didn't show up in the chat.
in the chat. No, I don't see it. I'm sorry. Other folks are saying they're not seeing
No,
it either.
sorry.
You can probably just grab that URL from your
Yes,
browser. Yep. And
yeah,
there it
got
is.
it.
Thank
Is it
you.
there? Okay,
Yep. Thank you.
my
Go ahead.
bad. Thank you for interrupting. That's we want everybody to have that. Sorry about that. It was stuck in the chat. Oh, and now 8 of you are here, so I see it's working. Okay, so the person mentions the size of the field. We know this seems to be some sort of standard size of a field of Beit Kor because it's used as all the examples in the Mishnah, but that's the stand-in, but it really could be any, if the person, it's a fill-in for whatever they stipulate, those particular size, right, area of the field. But in this case, what's unique in this Mishnah is with the description of the size of the field, it also includes particular demarcations and borders that the seller specifies for the buyer. Right, so here the field's measurement is not treated, right, as an exact. Here the field's measurement is not treated in the same way that it is in the standard sale, which we've seen earlier. The law is going to be a little different here because there's a list of the border, right? I'm selling you a field that's a Beit Kor, and on the north border it follows the river, and then there's a wooden fence to the east, and the road to the south, and on the west there's a stone wall. That demarks the field. So I've told you the borders of the field, and there's some clear descriptors that give you what that is. I tell you it's a Beit Kor, but because I add those descriptions that demark the borders of the field, that puts in a different category than what we've seen in earlier Mishnah. So the Mishnah deals with what happens if, it doesn't, the field in the end, I get the field from you and it doesn't show up the same way, or you get the field from me, I forget which way my example was, and it doesn't, the field is not exactly the size of a Beit Kor. So if it turns out, second paragraph here, that the field was not precisely a Beit Kor, but the difference is still less than 1/6, the field is the buyer's and the sale is valid as is. So we see here, I guess, a magic fraction for the rabbis, 1/6. If you remember back to Bava Metzia, 1/6 of a difference from the value of an object is what marks a fraudulent sale for the rabbis. If I overcharge you on a sale of anything, a product in my store or even a piece of land, more than 1/6, or I undercharge you less than by 1/6 or more, that makes the sale fraudulent because there's a principle that comes from the Torah that buying and selling is supposed to be fair and equitable, and part of that means the sale price should be close to the value. And the rabbi said if you miss on one end or the other by 1/6, the sale can be voided by the party who got either too little a purchase price or too little of the object. So that's the principle here too. But if it's more than 1/6, it's canceled. If it's less than 1/6, the sale is final, because 1/6 is that magic standard error that's allowed, or differential that's allowed. So if it turns out that the field was not exactly a Beit Kor, but the difference is less than 1/6, it stands, because less than 1/6 of a difference isn't significant to the rabbis. But if the difference is greater than 1/6, then the Mishnah uses a funny phrase here. Until it is calculated at 1/6, the seller must deduct the difference from the purchase price and return the money to the buyer. Meaning, you have to return the seller who sold 5/6 of what they said they were going to sell or less has to make up for that difference in area by returning some of the purchase price to the buyer. Or this phrase, until it is calculated at 1/6, I guess that means you could add back some land to correct for that. It's a weird phrase in the original Hebrew. It's a little awkward in the English as well, but seems to say there are some different ways you can correct for it. But the principle here is that if the buyer of the land gets 5/6 or less of what they thought they were getting, in a case where the field, it's stipulated that you're going to get a Beit Kor with the following borders. If the way in which the borders carve out a field that's off from the original agreed upon area, more than 1/6, we correct that, and the seller owes the buyer for the land they didn't get. So it's a lot of words in the Mishnah, and it took me a little while to explain through, but it's really the simple principle that follows what we know about rabbinic transactions, that 1/6 number is significant, and once you get 1/6 away from what something is worth, or here the area of the field, you have to correct for it. And in theory, this should be pretty straightforward, right? You have a transaction where the field is transferred based on the borders and demarcations that describe the field. It's later measured by the buyer. It comes up short. the seller has to correct for that. Then we
Rabbi
go to the,
Goldberg, you're getting many Talmudic questions on this Mishnah in the chat right now.
okay. Oh, I love this. So it's okay for the buyer to realize the buyer. So, okay, if it's 2/6 off, then the seller may have what about exactly 1/6? Oh, I love all those questions. I'm gonna summarize that some. So the piece of
This is why we need the Gemara, folks, right?
yeah, that is true. Yes, it appears here from this phrase until it is calculated at 1/6 that if you sell 4/6, if it's really short, you don't have to return to like the area of a bait core. You could just get it into the standard differential of 5/6. So if you're at right, if you've sold more than five, if you sold less than 5/6 of what you agreed upon, you just have to get it up to the 5/6. That seems what the Mishnah is saying here from this phrase until it is calculated at 1/6, that you can just adjust to the minimum, not to the baseline. But it is a weird phrase, and that's not something that usually happens. Usually the return is to that, that number in the middle of the, so that's unique here. And, but so that's a great question. I love the question too. What about exactly 1/6? In the conversation about fraud, it says that more than 1/6 on either end, the sale is canceled, and right, it's voided, and you can't. It goes back. Everyone returns everything, and you start over. But 1/6 exactly, the person who's defrauded could decide whether to keep the sale as valid or not. Meaning, in terms of sale in the marketplace, if you're beyond 1/6, it just gets voided. You can't agree, except for certain exceptions, of course, which the Talmud always has, to buy something for 7/6 or more, to sell something for 5/6 or less. It's automatically canceled, and at the exact mark, that's when you get a choice. You're right, and that's that's a good math question besides just a Mishnah question, right? That's where if you have a number line, if you remember from math, when the dot on the number line is filled in, the dot is included, right? The endpoint is included in the segment that you're demarking, and if the dot is not filled in, it's not part of the segment. That's a great question here too. It appears in this case that like at 1/6, it is a defraud. It is an unfair sale that must be corrected. Although people are based on these questions, you could see how complex that is. It seems that 1/6, is the line, and if you have to bring it based on this weird phrase in the last paragraph, you have to bring it back until 1/6, seems to indicate that in this case at exactly 5/6, right? Exactly when you're under by 1/6, that seems to be okay. That it has to be more than or greater with like that open endpoint, the open dot on the endpoint. Those are great questions. Just in terms of the definition of terms, and the Gemara, the best place to see the Gemara deal with this is back in Baba Metzia when it dealt with fraudulent sales, not here in the land transaction. The Baba Metzia digs into those questions that you just asked more so than the conversations here, but they're certainly relevant here as well. We're going to bring up now some other problems that come from the Gemara, but not in the form of questions, but in the form of a story. So we have the following story. So it was related that Rob Papa bought land from a certain person who, after specifying its demarcations and boundaries, said to him, "It's an area of 20 grieve, which means that it's fit for planting of 20 seah of grain." The 20 seah is a volume of grain, and the grieve is an area. And the exact value of this doesn't particularly matter for the story to make sense because the numbers will be clear. But the Gemara converts from area to volume of grain that you've used to seed it because of what comes later, you'll see. So Rav Papa buys land from an unnamed person. The person identifies an area of the land and gives demarcations and boundaries, like our Mishnah said. And the area is supposed to be enough for planting 20 seah of grain. Rav Papa gets the field, later measures it, and finds out it's only fit for planting 15 seah of grain. So now we have to do a little math. He could do 15 instead of 20. 15 over 20 is 3/4. So the land is 1/4 or 25% smaller than it's supposed to be. And that's a larger difference than the 1/6 threshold of the Mishnah that we just read. So this means, according to the Mishnah, Rav Papa is due back some of the money of his purchase price, or potentially, right, some land to make what he purchased closer to the size of what he expected. So Rav Papa goes before Abaye to sue the seller. Rav Papa goes to court and says, "I want some money back. Let's rectify this." And Abaye says to him, "You knew what you were buying and accepted the field as is." Wait a minute. That's what I had to say when I saw this. We have this case. It's clear the land is 1/4 smaller than it's supposed to be. 1/4 is a bigger difference than 1/6. The Mishnah says Rav Papa is due compensation for the smaller size, and Abaye rules against him, saying, "Well, you knew what size field you were getting and you accepted it, so um, tough tooties." I don't know. That's not really a Talmudic phrase, but it's more like maybe an elementary school one, but that seems what he says. You knew what you were buying and accepted it as is. The sale is, this is your field. Apparently here, right now, going against what we just saw in Mishnah. But Rav Papa is not done pleading his case. So Rav Papa raises an objection, which is sort of obvious. Even I included it before. He raises an objection from the Mishnah. Didn't we learn the difference is if the difference is less than 1/6, the field is the buyer's, sales valid, but if the difference is greater than 1/6, until it is calculated 1/6, the seller must deduct the difference from the purchase price. So either you got to rectify the size of the field or you got to change. And right, Rav Papa is quoting our Mishnah as a good Talmudic rabbi of the Talmud, of the Gemara in the Babylonian academies. He knew the Mishnah well and quoted it to Abaye. And Abaye says, this statement in the Mishnah applies to the case where the buyer is unfamiliar with the plot being sold to him. But in a case where he is familiar with it, he knew what he was buying and accepted it as is. Abaye, in this judicial ruling, significantly restricts the Mishnah. The Mishnah just says if you say the field's going to be a beit kor and it turns out to be 1/6 less than a beit kor, that's the threshold. It's purely about the area that was stipulated, and in a case where you define it also by its borders, when you acquire that field and measure it and find it to come up short, it's purely based on area. And Abaye is adding something new. If you know the field, Abaye could say to Rav Papa, that field you bought from this certain person, whoever they were, you know that field because it's right next to your property in the house that you grew up in. And when you were a kid, you used to play in it all the time, and it's familiar to you. You know every nook and cranny in the field, and you know there's that place where the river sort of curves in, and there's part of it that you can't, that if the river's the border on the north side, it's not really part of the field. You can't tell me you didn't know about that. And when you signed this agreement, you knew this about one beit kor field is a little short. And since you knew, because you're so familiar with it, in fact, everyone knows that field in our town, you knew this Mishnah doesn't apply. This is only the case when you are not familiar with the field. If you're familiar with the field, and you agreed to it, you agreed to it. And that's what it's supposed to be. You're stuck with the sale. It's final. This Mishnah does not apply to you. Rav Papa is still not done. He raises a principle we learned from before. Wait a minute, Rav Papa raises another objection, but the seller said to me that the field is fit for planting 20 seah, and it is not. He relies on the first part, not the demarcations that give borders that maybe make the plot of land a little different, right? It's not an even beit kor because of that. But here he says, here's what you could plant on, and here's what it's fit for planting, and it doesn't take that much seed. And we know from earlier Mishnayot, if you stipulate how much you could plant, and it doesn't show up at that amount, you could also make there's also some correction due to the buyer. And Abaye said to him, well, what he meant was the field's so good. It's as if, right, it's fruitful. It's so good. It's as if it's fit for planting 20 seah. So Abaye says, right, well, yeah, he said, here's my 20 seah property and here are all the borders to it. And what Abaye says the seller meant was, this is primo land. It's so good. It's going to increase your yield. it's so good. It's as if you could plant 20 say on it. You might plant less, but your yields are going to be great. And with that, the story ends, and Rav Papa, it seems, is left with his uh, 75% of the field that he thought he was buying. And we're left with the fact that it seems that the rule in the Mishnah might not be actually the rule in all cases, which, as if you've been with us for a while in Daf Yomi, you know that's sometimes what the Gemara does. I have a number of questions about what's going on here, and there are a number of possibilities for how we could resolve the tension between Gemara and Mishnah. Let me share a little bit about that, and then we'll take questions at the end. So my first question starts at the end here. Rob Papa says, here's what that the seller meant. It's a good field. It's as good as if you could plant 20 seah on it. I wonder, like, how does Abai know that? Does Abai know the field too and know this is primo land? And when you plant there, you're going to get an above average yield because like it's volcanic soil and it's awesome for growing crops. Or did Abai actually witness the sale and hear what the person said and he's correcting a misunderstanding? It's hard to know. It seemed when I first read it, my first response was, well, how could he know what the person meant? Is this actual or theoretical? Right? If it's theoretical, we have trouble with the mission of the whole chapter because the whole chapter is based on here's what the seller said and here's what happens when the buyer gets the field and how you correct for a difference between what the seller said and what actually happened. And much of the discussion this week has been about what the seller said actually matters. The way in which the seller describes the land matters, and we interpret that in particularly scripted ways so that we have fairness in buying, selling of land, and Abai seems to be undermining that altogether here. And I wonder what motivates him to do that. If he heard the exchange and said, Abai, Rav Papa, I was there at the sale, and he wasn't giving you an actual measurement. He was just bragging about how good this land is, and you understood him wrong. Maybe that's a way to rule differently, but we have no evidence in this story. The story doesn't write the person who sold the land is barely a character. So we have no way to determine that at all. Second, going back to that middle piece where Abai says, we apply this to when you're unfamiliar. Now, there is a logic to that, right? When someone says, I'm selling you a Beit Korv land and here are the boundaries, so you know what marks the field when you go and take possession of it. Certainly, we want to protect the person from out of town, the person who doesn't know the land, from getting a piece of land that's too small. And that's what Abai allows for, and that makes sense. But the fact that Abai says that's all this mission is trying to protect, the buyer who doesn't know the land, and the person who knows the land should know better. And if they agree to the sale, they agree to the sale, and it's solid. I don't see that all in the language of the Mishnah or even in the spirit of this chapter. And Abai seems to say, but then again, that's the case here. You, Rav Papa, know this land. You should know there's a problem. Maybe I'm reading this, and everyone maybe knows this is a problem. And you're stuck with the sale as is. You can't hide under the rule of this Mishnah because you know better. It doesn't strike me as the best judicial stance that Abai is coming to here because often the protections the Mishnah builds in are to protect someone from a fraudulent sale, and when it's above 1/6 of a difference, that's in the category of fraud for the rabbis. And it seems that whether Rav Papa knew this land well or not, he accepted what he was told, and he loses out here. So I feel for Rav Papa a little bit. Makes me feel that on one hand, maybe at least in this case, somehow Abai has some beef with Rav Papa. And somehow that maybe this is personal. We don't see there's a Rav Papa and Abai show up together in different stories. I don't know if they're not a famous warring pair of Amoraim in the Gemara, although there are lots of stories about the two of them, and I'm sure they disagree about things in other places. But I wonder, is Abai misapplying the law here? because he has some grievance against Rav Papa? Is there some reason why Rav Papa is being held to a different standard? Is it that Rav Papa, who's a rabbi and knows these rules, maybe should know better to check all this out and doesn't need the protection of the law since he's an expert in what the law is for? And Rabbi is saying Rav Papa has to meet a higher standard? Maybe, but none of those things feel sort of in the spirit of what we've been reading in this chapter. Um, Leads me to one more possibility. It's possible that Abai is reporting to us what Abai is not interpreting on the spot, but the way in which Abai learned the Mishnah. Meaning, we know the Mishnah is concise in language, it's brief. The context in which any individual Mishnah originally came from is not always included in the Mishnah. And this information that Abai is applying here, that says, this Mishnah only applies to someone who's unfamiliar to the land. It might be something that was so obvious to them then, the Mishnah didn't need to say it. And therefore, what Abai is just saying is reminding Rav Papa of how the Mishnah was understood in their day. It's not from a fresh reading when we looked at it for the first time today, or when maybe earlier in the week, what the Mishnah seems to say, and the commentators of the Mishnah, without taking into account what the Gemara says about it, don't limit it in this way, because the Mishnah doesn't seem to limit itself. But it seems to be here we have Abaye sitting in judgment, maybe passing on the tradition of what he knows about the Mishnah, or maybe choosing in this moment to limit how he thinks it should be applied. Maybe for fairness, maybe he thinks that, right, there's certain people should know, and if they accept the sale is binding. Two people make an agreement, you should hold to it. And the exception that this Mishnah applies to undo the sale is just for people who are ignorant of the land, which Rav Papa doesn't fall into that category. So I appreciate that maybe I've raised more questions than I answered about this story and its relationship to the Mishnah. That in part is sometimes what the Gemara leaves us with. And oftentimes these limitations on the Mishnah find their way into law, and oftentimes these limitations that the Gemara puts on the Mishnah are not accepted later on. It's just amazes me though to see the power the Gemara has to shape the Gemara. The power the Gemara has to shape the Mishnah, and the Mishnah, which has a pretty simple principle, the 1/6 rule, turns out it might not be so simple. Which leads me to my final point before I'll come back and we'll deal with some questions in the couple of minutes we have left. One of the rabbinic principles is, it's sort of two-headed in some ways. One principle is that there's the older a source, the earlier a rabbi, the more authority they have. So the Mishnah is more authoritative than the Gemara, right? The Mishnah says something, it's more authoritative, right? The Gemara can't contradict it outright, but the rabbis of the Gemara recognize that it's the later generations who are the determiners about how the law actually applies. So while the Mishnah is authoritative, the Gemara recognizes the power of interpretation, gives them the ability, while not contradicting the Mishnah when it says outright, to limit the cases where it applies. And in this sense, they limit it in a way that maybe cuts Rav Papa out of the protection that the Mishnah was there to provide. But Abaye, as a judge with the text and the case in front of him, has the ability to interpret it. And his interpretation, by contextualizing the Mishnah, is definitely one that's within the bounds of what the Gemara and the judges who appear in it are empowered to do. And we see that today. All right, I'm going to come back. Apologies. I notice I'm showing you the slides in editing mode. I didn't go to presentation, so the font size was a little smaller. Apologies for not making it bigger for you there. Anyways, wanted to get the apology in.
That's okay. We only have 1 minute left, but if anyone wants to put up a hand and ask some questions, I do think this is an important and interesting point, that this dynamic between the Gemara and the Mishnah, that the Gemara defers to the Mishnah because they are more ancient rabbis. They are their predecessors, and this whole concept that holiness reduces through the generations and so forth. And yet, within that rhetoric and framework, the Gemara then takes plenty of freedom to really sometimes just, if not modified outright, defy the Mishnah sometimes. It really
Yeah.
does. So it's a very interesting dynamic. Carol. Have we got you, Carol? I see your hand. Can you turn on your camera?
Okay, I got it.
There you are.
Sure. So Rabbi, thank you for this. It's really interesting and sort of complicated, but I want to ask you a question that you kind of posed about this Daf and maybe all of Gemara. What are they more interested in, theory or practice?
Oh, that's a doozy of a question, and I
Just a little
love it.
question for the 1 minute remaining, Rabbi Goldberg. Go for it.
Yes, for the 1 minute. Well, Carol, you can, people probably have, but you could write a dissertation with that question as it's motivating your research. Um, uh, in some ways, well, the Gemara is interested in both. Which is it interested in more? Hard for me to weigh in on, partly because the vastness of the Gemara. Certainly, there are lots of story. Like we had a story today about practical application of law. Sometimes, we get so into weeds, and the weeds become so twisted by their logic, the logic that gets us to them. We can't, imagine that the case that the Gemara is dealing with is ever something that really came to be, and it's just theoretical. We do have a sense that the Gemara was a text of the academy and meant for rabbis who were studying the law and looking at it at a higher level. This was not designed to be a popular text, right? The way in which, right, the Torah is read regularly in synagogue and was in the days of the rabbis, and it was meant for everyone to hear regularly. And the Talmud was not something that the rabbis had visioned that everyone should read and study. The ways, more and more people are doing with the Daf Yomi cycle every year now. But there's both a focus on practical and theoretical. Sort of, if you mirrored in the way I see in the chat as I skim through it, there were some great theoretical conversations about economics here. Looking at the 1/6 rule and what that would mean for the stock market and other places. So some of this could be economic theory, and some of this could be really theoretical about how do we advise judges to settle disputes about all the ways that buying and selling land can go wrong, because in their day, much more than in ours, the tools to measure and demark and clarify land were not so clear. There's a lot of practical advice in the Talmud, but it's certainly not all practical. And in the way I'm meandering through this answer, I guess I'm trying to I'm highlighting the complexity of your question, trying to shed some clarity there, and I hope that was clear, even though not totally decisive.
Well, if it wasn't, you can come back for more next week and ask our next presenter, right?
I'm sure this won't be the last time this comes up.
Or come back in a couple weeks, we'll have Rabbi Goldberg again. So thank you everybody for coming, for learning with us, for asking great questions and making great observations. I hope you all had a wonderful Rosh Hashanah, and I wish you all a Gemar Chatima Tova and a Shabbat Shalom for Yom Kippur, which is also Shabbat Shabbaton. Falls on Shabbat this year, and we will see you. Oh, I'm sorry, we will not meet for a little while. I should have made that announcement at the top, because the next 2 Thursdays are Chag, right? Beginning of Sukkot, and then it's either Shmini Atzeret or Simchat Torah for the Thursday following. So we will take a little pause here, but the emails will not stop, and we will come back. Thank you, Emily, for the purple imp. We will come back in this space soon. So I wish all of you a good rest of this holiday season, and I will look forward to seeing you on our return. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.